The state level certification is the blue bucket. And that just really means that the project would be totally bypassing local zoning, and instead the developer would submit all of the site plan, all of the application documentation to the Michigan Public Service Commission. What would be kind of the criteria that the MPC considers is an extensive list. It basically has the same setbacks and standards and those traditional zoning items that are in section 2268 of the law, but has a little bit more. It's a little beefier than a CREO because the MPSC has minimum conditions of approval. There are some interesting evaluation criteria that the MPSC by law has to consider on impact on farmland, impact on local land use. The past couple of months, the MPSC has really, like when they found out in November that now they are charged with implementing this law, their staff has really tried to understand how this could work best. There has been a series of stakeholder engagement workshops from February onwards all summer. And actually last week, Thursday, 1 week ago, the commission decided on their final instructions of how the developer would need to, what they all would need to submit to apply to the MPSC. For the longest time, that was in draft version, and all of my slides had a bunch of asterisks and caveats and question marks and whatever on it. There's still some question marks on here, but technically, since last week, Thursday, we now know what the MPSC will require, and that's really important because the, as you'll see later, teaser. So it's very permissive zoning standards with regards to setback and those kind of things, but there's a lot of extra stuff the MPSC is asking for with very due diligence and strong enforcement. The yellow and the red ordinances are good old zoning ordinances that don't meet the CREO criteria. So technically they are incompatible. The difference between orange or yellow and red is that one of them is workable for a developer, and it depends entirely on what one particular developer finds workable in Sullivan Township. And a red ordinance, if I take it to the extreme, is a very restrictive ordinance with a laundry list of wishes that the community has always wanted to have in their renewable energy zoning ordinance. So finding like the difference as to what is workable and what is unworkable, I'll talk about this more later. But I do want to remind you that as long as you don't have a CREO, if you're in this incompatible ordinance realm, at any point could a developer say, you know what, this is too complicated here. I have the state option. I'm going to take it to the state. So the difference is kind of, and you will see these colors throughout the slides. What I understand as an unworkable ordinance by definition is the developer finds it not doable and would prefer the MPSC process over the unworkable option. And therefore having an unworkable ordinance would most likely result in the project being taken to the state. To be fair, I think the majority of zoning ordinances in Michigan that includes renewable energy is unworkable. Because I think the idea of zoning ordinances is to have limitation on location. Certain districts are appropriate and some other districts may not be appropriate. So that kind of by default renders an ordinance incompatible. But there's standards in many ordinances in Michigan that have in the past been renewable energy development. This is at the end of the day why this law came about in the first place. Okay. You may wonder, why am I talking about workable ordinances? Why doesn't the developer just take it to the state and be done and not deal with the township? There are multiple reasons why workable ordinances can work. And it really is that the state citing process is more expensive because the developer needs to hire a bunch of fancy lawyers and shiny shoes and to do a lot of extra evaluation and extra plans. And needs to submit a very extensive list of requirements. It is very, very time intensive. The MPSC has a whole year to think about whether or not they want to permit a project. And it also is unpopular from the perspective of developers sometimes tell me, granted, I am not a developer, but that they want to work with local governments, or some of them really want to make it work at the local level, and just coming in hot with the state process is also kind of unpopular. So a lot of the developers that our team has kind of talked to, or have we heard of, or also communities that we've been working with, they tell us a lot of developers actually want to keep it at the local level, even if it's not meeting these CREO standards, because of how expensive and time consuming the state process is. And we actually, or my colleague Sarah Mills has been involved in some research where they interview developers all across the country. And it's kind of generally perceived by developers that state processes are always more expensive than the local process and are also yielding fewer local benefits, which at the end of the day, no one likes. But it is not true for all developers at the end of the day. The state process still provides an option for developers to get a project built. So they may want, or they have interest in working locally with you, but some developers may also just go straight to the MPSC. Another thing why workable ordinances can work, and it's the timing of this next slide, a little weird, but I don't know how to put it in better, is the Renewables Ready Communities Award by EGLE. A team of colleagues or folks at EGLE have created this award. It's a $30 million pot of money that they're handing out to those local governments that are permitting a project at the local level through a CREO or through whatever workable ordinance, as long as it's not the state process. Communities that host at the local level are eligible for a $5,000 per megawatt one-time grant that can basically be spent however the township pleases. This is to provide a bit of a balance because the state process makes the developer pay $2,000 per megawatt in the host community agreement. And because that component is kind of missing on the local side, EGLE decided we don't want to discourage communities from writing zoning ordinances and permitting projects at the local level. Hence, they created this balance so that there's a financial interest also at the local level. My next slides are going to be titled Why Not, and How. And that is basically the benefits or the pros and cons of each of these pathways. And I also want to say that there is no wrong or one right pathway, but all of them kind of have pros and cons. So a community may be interested in passing a CREO if they want to host renewables. That's like the most preferable type of ordinance you could for a developer from a developer's perspective. If you really want to be first in line, you pass a CREO, and that should make development very easy in your community. The CREO is the only way that guarantees that the project is being permitted at the local level. Though I use the word performatively on the slide because it is really limited as to what you can put in a CREO. There's a little bit of a caveat with multi-jurisdictional projects. Imagine a solar project is being proposed in Solon Township, and part of that is in the neighboring township. If one community has a CREO, but the other one has an ordinance that absolutely is not doable for the developer, the whole project goes to the MPSC. In the guidance that was released last week, and I have to admit that I still haven't fully understood 180 pages in their entirety, but there are some weird like nuances as to if that really were to happen. Let's say you have a CREO, your neighbor has an unworkable ordinance, and it goes to the state, that you would have some certain type of benefits and can present the case to the commission, to the Michigan Public Service Commission, say, look, we really try to make it work. So you would still be eligible for the Renewables Ready Communities Award, and the project goes to state level. I'm confusing, and the MPSC really needs to figure that out. But technically, there is the risk for multi-jurisdictional projects, and many of the solar and wind projects go across township lines. That the project goes to the state, even if you had a CREO. Passing a CREO is, I think, one of the options, like one of the least workload type of options. If capacity is the problem, and that is a problem in a lot of communities I'm talking with, there are sample CREOs available at any one Michigan Townships Association. We have made one, so it's really rather straightforward. And then at the bottom, the last bullet points of the Y CREO bucket is RCA, which is the Renewables Ready Communities Award. I just mentioned the $5,000 per megawatt. The blue, the MPSC path, why would a community decide to send it to the state? Well, if a community has looked at what the MPSCs all requiring from the developer and thinks, I'm comfortable with that, then it's really low workload on your end. And it also, and I know that's an issue in some communities, it really passes accountability to the state and like, stick it to the state type of thing. And you would get the guaranteed host community agreement that the developer has to pay you of $2,000 per megawatt. And you would get a $75,000 grant to intervene, of which you have to pay any leftovers back, but that really enables you to financially to hire an attorney to represent you in this contested case process that would be in the state. The benefit of a workable ordinance is really that it tries to keep the process, the permitting process of a project at the local level, and you can put a little bit more zoning preferences in there than you could in a CREO. If the crux with the workable ordinance is a little bit that you don't know what's workable until the developer tells you, I don't like that. And so it really is important to show kind of flexibility and to be willing to amend your ordinance again if the developer were to say, this doesn't really look workable to me. It maintains the process at the local level and you would be eligible for the $5,000 RCA. So why ever one workable ordinance is well, some communities are like, why do you even put that on the slide? But some communities do want to do that. And they want to have all of their wishes and everything that they ever thought like they wanted in a zoning ordinance. They want to show if people care about. I don't care if it goes to the state. It may be the ordinance you already have in the books, or a community might already have in the books. And it really expresses all the community preferences. But as it would probably kick to the MPSC for permitting, it then also receives all of the MPSC why and why nots. Let's talk about the why nots. So with a CREO, I know that it's kind of restrained as to what can be in a CREO, so you cannot really add any more preferences. And if you deny a project, if you had a CREO and you denied a project, and the developer says, well, but my project is compatible with the law, then the project would still go to the state. You would not have the intervener funds, and you would not get the RCA. So there's a bit of a penalty with it if you claim to have a CREO, if you don't really have a CREO, or if you take longer than the really strict timeframes that are set out for a CREO. I think you have 30 days to notify a developer that you have a CREO. And then you have to basically approve or deny the project within 120 days, which is really quick. And like I said before, it depends a little bit on what your neighbors are doing. If they don't have a workable ordinance or a CREO, and the project were to extend from their township as well, the project could, at the end of the day, still go to the state. So it's like the caveat is guaranteed to keep it local. Why some communities may choose to not go through the MPSC is that you, again, can't add any more preferences than what the MPSC is set out to do. The MPSC process does come with strong conditions, but we don't really know how they're going to apply this. Some of the conditions are alternative locations analysis. The developer has to explain the impact on prime farmland in the township, but how the MPSC will decide on this, we don't know. And their order that was released last week is also silent on the how they will evaluate farmland impact land uses. So we don't know until we see it.
Going through the state makes you ineligible for the RSJ because the state can get the developer paid $2,000 per megawatt, and it's obviously not at the local level. Why you may not want to go with a workable ordinance is really because that's the option that takes the most work. Figuring out how to create an ordinance that's kind of well balanced, that includes some of the community priorities, but maybe also make some concessions, kind of was developed in negotiations. I don't like saying that word in the context of zoning, but basically a negotiated zoning ordinance. And at any time, you have the risk that the developer says, you know what, this is too complicated, I'm taking it to the state. The why nots with an unworkable ordinance is that very, very likely that project will then be taken to the state, and because the developer would call your ordinance unworkable and incompatible and then take it to the state. Okay, if you wanted to do any of these four things, here's how would you do it. So for a CREO, you'd pass an ordinance. This is the law language, no more restrictive than the standards laid out in section 2268 of PA 233, which is the most conservative and most risk-averse understanding of a CREO that we're kind of running with. If you were to want to go and just by default say, you know what, we're okay with all projects being permitted at the state. It probably means that you don't pass or update your zoning ordinance, or I think in your case, you don't have one.
Yeah, so we don't have any regulations regarding anything at all.
Okay.
So
you would, if you wanted to go with MPSC, you just stay like this and say, once a project were to be proposed, you just tell the developer, you know, please go to the state.
yes, for the ones over 300, I mean, we are open to litigation because we don't have anything in our code at all. If somebody comes to us and asks us, I want to build that there, and we just say no because we don't address it in our code. But so there will be something that we'll have to do in our code.
You could, yes, or you could just say in your code, projects over 50 megawatts for solar are pleased to be permitted through the state.
Yeah, the problem would be everything less than 50 megawatts. So
yeah, I see. Okay. So the MPSC has last week released also like how you were to go about requesting them to permit your project. So there's instructions on that now too. How to do a workable ordinance is really the tricky one. You kind of start with, if you want to keep it local and want to have a workable ordinance, what you need to balance it against is basically the MPSC route. And maybe there are some things in the MPSC process that you can live without, that you can kind of like strike out, but then include also those priorities that you have, and pass a well-informed ordinance and really show willingness to converse and to potentially amend it again when a developer comes around the corner. The important thing is to not say, I have a CREO, because if you then deny a project or take longer, then you have these CREO penalties of not receiving the intervenor funding and those type of things. If you want to go about an unworkable ordinance, you either, not in your case, you would maintain an incompatible ordinance, but you would pass an incompatible or unworkable ordinance. Again, also don't claim that you have a CREO. And then you also, if a developer comes, tell them, I don't have an interest in making this workable. Please, please try to make this work at the local level. And then it will ultimately probably result in the developer saying, okay, I'll go to the state. Okay, so I just talked about like how you would go about each of the ways. And I think the Creo is pretty straightforward-ish. The MPSC route, if you wanted to choose that, is pretty straightforward-ish. But what's tricky is the workability component. So I want to spend a little bit more time on that. And you see my slide called Workability is a Balance. It has these scales. That is just to demonstrate again, from a developer's perspective, their ideal ordinance is a Creo because it's the easiest, it's the cheapest, it's the quickest. And the MPSC route, I'm looking at the scale on the left-hand side of the slide, is kind of like heavier. There's more stuff in it. On the right side of the sheet of the slide is kind of like the MPSC route is higher up. It's preferable over an incompatible heavy ordinance. So the tricky point with a workable ordinance is really something that is just as cumbersome for the developer as the MPSC process, but actually contains what you care about. And to kind of start doing that, you would, I mentioned it briefly before, but really like think about what are the things that we really care about the most in our community, and which are some of the zoning items that if we had to, could also live without. And at which point is something so important to us that we even want to risk the project being taken to the state. So to get a little bit of a sense for, or a better sense for workability, we've actually looked at what hasn't worked before. We went through all of the zoning ordinances. I think it was for 25 projects, if I'm not mistaken. We looked at all of the big operating solar and wind projects in Michigan and looked at the ordinances that were in place when those projects were permitted. And this is what you kind of see on the slide. I don't even know what number that is. 13, guidance on what has worked before. We really went through, pulled everything into a big Excel sheet, and then actually color coded the ordinances too and said, oh, this looks like PH33. This doesn't look like PH33. We mark this yellow, but we actually have seen that in another ordinance too. So that way we kind of got a sense for these are the general sound standards we often see in these kind of ordinances, or these are the setback ranges that communities have used. We have this information public. There's the link. Feel free to check it out. What I really want to acknowledge though with these, when we look at this data, is that these projects were permitted when the lay of the land was a different one. And all of these ordinances had at least some green standards. So these really central standards of setbacks, sound in section 2268, none of these ordinances was stricter than PA 233 in all categories. They all had some green, so to speak. But also all of those ordinances had restrictions in their ordinance that we don't find in the law because they're normal to zoning, such as districting or maybe an overlay or things like that. So none of these were technically a Creo, but also they didn't max out all the, like were the strictest in each category. Another thing, the second thing I want to have you keep in mind is that just because it worked somewhere doesn't necessarily mean it would work for you. If you, for example, take setbacks and the lots in your community are smaller than in that community, then that immediately may not be workable for you. So don't copy and assume it's workable. I want to talk through a couple of traditional zoning items and how they compare in the different buckets, in the different colored buckets. So right now I am looking at a slide called Solar Sound. You recognize the four colors. So the sound standard that the Creo has to include is a sound standard of 55 decibels measured over an hour on average. So that's what the LEQ 1 hour means. And it is measured at the non-participating structure, NP structure, which I would bet if you have a sound ordinance, it's probably measuring at the property line because that's what many, many zoning ordinances do. But the people who wrote this law are not necessarily zoning experts. Okay, so non-participating structure, 55 dBA LAQ. There's a tricky thing, and I don't really want to open up the can of worms because the way the MPSC found that measuring sound at a wall is actually really difficult because the wall bounces back noise. So technically, it's actually a 49 decibel at wall standard, which a lot of developers are really upset about. So that is what I have, the caveat at the bottom is outer wall measurement penalty. If you're interested in learning more about this, I can talk more about this later, or also recommend you checking out the sound limits generally were made from the property line, the non-part, and there's a really big range of sound standards. Some ordinances just say ambient noise +5, and on the other extreme, we would have something like a 60 decibel L max. And what the difference between LAQ and L max is that you have your noise measuring machine. And if at any time it reaches the number 60, you would be out of compliance. So it is measured at an instant, and LAQ is measured over the average noise in 1 hour. Unworkable, and this is a pretty extreme, unworkable solar sound standard would be something like 45 or anything below 45 L max. So max is really hard to obtain, and the 45 is rather low at the property line. So sound, I want to use sound as an example for like different strategies of how to think about workability. So strategy one would be taking a Creo item, such as sound, and fine-tuning it a little bit. Like I just said, there's different ways or different things about the sound standard that you could tweak, like the LMAX versus LAQ, or the measurement location. Do I have the ear at the house, or do I have the ear at the property line? And then ultimately the number which of the three is actually the least impactful or the least important. So the sound standard in the law for Creos and for the MPC process is permissive in 3 ways. It only takes the average noise. It is measuring it further away from the project, AKA at the structure. And there's only a sound standard for non-participants, not also for participants. So these are kind of like the tweaking points if you wanted to go about changing something that's in a Creo, but making it a little bit more matching with what you care about. These are the points where you could turn it. I want to talk about a second example. And again, this is kind of for the case of solar because it plays out differently for wind or for storage, which is in a Creo, you can't ask for screening, period. The MPSC has it a condition of approval, and it's kind of a case-by-case individual decision by the commission. Workable screening, and it's not uncommon that there's screening in existing solar projects, but it's often referring to the underlying zoning district plus maybe where there is a residential neighbor that we have a little bit of vegetative screening there, but it's typically not around the whole project, 3 rows of mature trees and a mini forest. That's kind of the unworkable extreme example. Screening is an example for where you could mirror an MPSC item and really have it, if screening is the thing that you care about the most. Let's say you'd have a really bare bones ordinance that kind of looks like a Creo almost, and you only add screening, that is very likely to be workable because at the end of the day, probably the developer would have to do some sort of screening through the state process anyways. So if you stay close to the language of what the MPSC requires, that should not kick you to the unworkable curb. Location control, I'm on the next slide. really a big one. And I think from people who plan and who zone and kind of think in districts, that is really the hardest pill to swallow almost. It's so again, we think of a CREO as a permitted use in all districts. The MPSC does that too, but has these interesting evaluation criteria of one, that the project will not unreasonable diminish prime farmland. Two, that the developer shall consider feasible alternative development locations and explain why they were not chosen. MPSC should please consider impact on local land use, including the percentage of land dedicated to energy generation already in the jurisdiction. But what kind of teeth the MPSC will apply to this, we don't really know. Workable ordinances have all included some sort of districting, but it is something where you can really quickly get into the unworkable territory if you, for example, in a township like yours, would take out ag land out of the potential pool of I increasingly see very small overlays. Because at the end of the day, land that the developer will seek is close to the transmission infrastructure. Ideally, it is cleared and flat, but that's not always the case. And it really allows for large enough patch sizes so that even if some landowners say, no, thank you, I'm not interested to lease my land to you, that at the end of the day, there's still enough land available for a developer to develop a project. And then the unworkable component would be not enough land to develop a project on. Location control is an example for deal breaker zoning items that you could do everything right and really try your best to be reasonable and to create a workable ordinance. But with just the one thing, location control, you could really break the bank. And I think this is especially important. That is the last bullet point on the strategy 3 slide is it's really difficult when a developer has already expressed interest in your community and already has an eye on that one location and already is a lease signed with a developer, making the developer then change their mind and go elsewhere because you would prefer for them to go there. That's difficult. And it really puts you at a weird bargaining position. My last example is the review timeline. So something that we probably don't think about in zoning often, but that is like a really big thing for the developer is the timeline of things. So a CREO, you'd have 120 days to review the application and approve or deny. It can be extended when the township and the developer mutually agree to another 120 days. But on the maximum, it would be 240 days. The MPSC process, I mentioned it earlier, takes a year. And then a workable ordinance is anywhere in between. Time really is money for the developer, and 365 days is long. They need to wait, basically with ordering parts, those sorts of things. So if you can make a commitment of saying within this time frame, we can comfortably approve a complete or review and process a complete application, that really buys you wiggle room that maybe you can have a bit of a stricter setback or a stricter sound limit or more screening. If you can basically save the developer some stress in this timeline space. That leads me to strategy 4, get yourself some easy wiggle room. Timeline is one example. You would cut the cost for the developer, and time really is money in that case. Another example for easy wiggle room are some of the things that the MPSC requires that most local governments I've talked to don't really care about. Some of that is fair labor requirements. The alternative locations analysis is something that I've heard from communities that they care about and would like to require a developer to show why they don't go somewhere else. But at the end of the day, if you can't decide on it, and if you can't really enforce this, then maybe spare them the paperwork and instead you can get something that you care more about. Another example is that the MPSC requires at the application stage that the developer shows which state agencies and federal agencies they've already talked to and consulted with. At the end of the day, they still need to get all of the permits, but do you want to see that they have already something else that you care about more? There's a couple of things like that. Okay, I'm looking at a slide now called Workability is a Balance. There are some pictures on there, and these pictures were actually taken at a workshop that I have done together with a couple of folks at Eagle. One more workshop coming up, and I'm going to mention it early. It will come again later. On October 28th, in 2 weeks, we have a workshop in Kalamazoo that you're all very welcome to join. It's a whole day thing though. It's from 9 to 2, but you'd be very welcome to come. There, we actually have a bit of a card activity where we use some of the cards that I've already talked about now, the colors and the different zoning items, and kind of play a game, build your dream ordinance. And now then I prompt you, take one red item away. If you had to choose one, which one would it be? To kind of flex the muscle a little bit on workable, making concessions, and really thinking about what are the priorities and what do I care less about. I have one slide here called Planning Community Engagement Memos, ? And you are in a very great spot in that you are currently reviewing your master plan. Is that right? Yes, I see some nodding. So a lot of communities are not in that position and want to immediately jump into zoning. And I wouldn't be a good planner if I didn't tell you, you have to plan first and think about your master plan goals and how kind of does that work? How does that align or fit with those zoning amendments that you're wanting to do? So this slide doesn't totally apply to you as much as some of the other townships I'm talking to, but it's really about identifying the top concerns and priorities to inform a workable ordinance, if that is a route that you want to go. I brought some maps, and I brought some maps for Linden Township too. I don't know if you guys are from Linden Township. No. Okay, cool. I brought some Sylvan Township wind and solar maps, and I have not made those maps. I do have to give the credit to Eagle. There's a team at Eagle who makes these maps and basically looks at suitability. So something these maps consider is transmission infrastructure, slope, land cover. It's like really forested. It's less green. That's the type of projects that the law includes as well. But we don't have much knowledge of battery energy storage, and we don't have battery storage projects in Michigan yet. And actually, this is a very shameless plug. Some of you may be familiar with U of M's solar guidebook, where we have a bit of an explainer on solar and then sample zoning language. And last week I finished. If that's something you'd like to learn more about, feel free to, I have some copies. Either way, these maps kind of give you a bit of a sense for which areas in our community are actually even viable for development. And just because it's red doesn't mean it's totally unviable. And just because it's green doesn't mean that any developer would immediately want to go there, but it just gives you a bit of a sense. So like I said, it's considering open land, it's greener on the map. What else does it consider? Proximity to transmission infrastructure, and then like waterways are kind of red, or roads are red as well. What I really would like to encourage you to do now that you are thinking about your master plan goals is how maybe some of the goals that you already have actually link to renewable energy. And I also want to acknowledge that sometimes everyone thinks of something else when they think of one master plan goal, and that sometimes master plan goals also are in conflict with each other. I have a slide that's titled, "What are you trying to preserve?" And that's like one of our go-to slides that we usually spend a lot of time on. And I am sensitive solar a threat in your eyes to farmland, or is it an opportunity? And I think how someone answers this question really depends on what they understand under farmland preservation. And I also think that a lot of people understand different things under farmland preservation. Planners often think of it as an urban boundary, kind of like keeping the lower density or the higher density land uses separate from lower density land uses, and not extending sewer and water and all of those types of things. And in that sense, or preventing subdivision development, and in that sense, the way the different energy types are playing into this goal of preserving an urban boundary, or actually, if you have a solar project somewhere, you're not going to see a subdivision development there anytime for the next 30 years. The same with wind turbine probably too. The battery energy storage projects, they're so small, they kind of fit anywhere. So in that sense, that doesn't necessarily, or is not as aligned. The rural vista, or is not contradictory, sorry. I think a lot of people think of rural vista when they live out in the country, and this is why I moved here, and that is really valid of a concern when we think about the visual impact of wind turbines, right, that we see from miles away. And even solar projects, I think, have a visual impact too, if you think about driving through 1,900 acres of solar panels for minutes. But it is more easily hideable, right? You can have some screening, depending on the topography, you may not even see it behind the hill. Really depends on kind of your landscape too. There's the largest solar project in Michigan is in Shiawassee County, flat, and you can see kind of the initial rows of solar panels, but the second largest project operational in Michigan is in Calhoun County. And we have rolling hills there, and from some of the viewpoints, you really see like a lake of solar panels. So that's always something that I find mind-blowing. Habitat is a concern often when we talk about birds and bats with wind turbines, or how do deer change the patterns they walk around our neighborhood when we have a bunch of fences around solar projects. So those are some of the concerns. And habitat, though, is something where renewable energy kind of conflicts with the least, because after the construction of a solar project is done, small animals can come back into kind of a quiet solar project now through the wildlife fence. The issue with deer is still an issue, and DNR is kind of trying to figure out how to prevent deer from jumping in all the time and not being able to jump back out. And battery storage projects, again, are so small, they really take a very small area of habitat out. And I forgot to say, for solar panels, it really can be beneficial depending on what you plant underneath the panels, and it can be pollinator habitat and those sort of things. The two last ones, land for growing food and farmland, where it's at, and where the concern with the scale of solar projects and their impact on land for growing food is a concern I hear a lot. And at the same time, I do want to spend a little bit or a moment talking about farm livelihoods, because that is really something my colleague Sarah Mills has looked at a lot, has interviewed wind farmers in Michigan, and has really heard a lot of stories about supplemental income for the farm, ensuring succession plans for farmers who are leasing out a couple of acres for wind turbines. So in that sense, wind very much in line with kind of farm livelihoods. Solar plays out a little bit differently, and also very interesting. It's kind of threefold. 1/3 of people that she has talked to in Michigan sells their land, moves away, and spends their money in Arizona or Florida. Awesome retirement. Or they retire, sell or lease all of their property, but stay in Michigan and spend their money from the purchase kind of in the community. And then there are some farmers who just lease the back 40 who have always been unproductive anyways, and use that supplemental income to buy another tractor, buy more land. So it's really interesting how that plays out differently for the different technologies. My takeaway from the slide, what do you really understand when you think of a master plan goal? And I think farmland preservation is just one example of how people can mean different things. And how you would go about zoning differently, depending on if it's Vista that you care more about or more of an economic development opportunity. So what's next is, I'm almost done, you guys. You guys are involved in your master plan. So thinking about master planning goals, priorities, which of the 4 strategies is the strategy that you feel comfortable with? It has a little bit to do with risk that you're comfortable with taking or not. Also the temperature in the community when it comes to these things. And I think you already have a great planner on board, and then getting your municipal attorney on board as well is really important in this conversation about renewable energy as well. If a CREO is something that is really interesting to you, I would suggest you talk to your neighbors and see if they're also CREOing, or if they're unworkable or whatever their process is, because that may influence which pathway you choose for yourself. If you do choose a path that requires amending or creating a zoning ordinance, which is the path you're in, I'm sorry, these are like generic slides, but I'm on the fly trying to make it applicable to you. Really moving quickly on those amendments, but my understanding is that there is no development interest so far here. I have a list of resources. The MPSC has their final order and how they kind of view process those state permitted projects, but also the stakeholder engagement workshops are there. It's really interesting for me to also, on the earlier draft versions from the MPSC, to see what are people commenting, what are the industry groups commenting, what do they like about the MPSC order and whatnot, and what does MTA submit, and kind of to get a sense for where are the sticky points for the different interest groups. That's how I spend my free time. We have a list of resources as well. We have some FAQs that need a little bit of updating now that the MPSC has released their stuff. We have the guidance on the workable data. We have a sample CREO. We have our old guidebooks. There's a guidebook MSU has done on wind zoning. There's a collaborative flame-made solar guide and now the battery storage guide. And we've annotated the old solar and wind guides to kind of see where are parallels with the law and where do these guides no longer make sense. Ultimately, we'd like to update them to reflect the new legislative landscape. MTA has a couple of great resources too. If you remember the sample CREO, they have a couple of like sample documents, and they have a workshop series, I believe, too. And the last group of resources is from EGLE. And here again, I want to shout out the Renewable Energy Academy workshops. Join us in Kalamazoo. It's going to be fun doing all of this, but a little bit more in depth. And EGLE is also managing the Renewables Ready Communities Award, if you have any questions about this, and the Michigan Zoning Database, which is on EGLE's website, but our team kind of feeds and has tried to capture all of the zoning ordinances in Michigan to understand how do communities include wind and solar in their zoning ordinance. Okay. We have time for questions now, but also if you have any questions beyond today, feel free to reach out to Sarah or me, my colleague, and yeah, I'll put it to you.
I think I just want a clarification. You always, when you give these presentations, you're always like, there's this time frame, time limit, time everything. And I want to make it clear to everybody that if we're not creating a CREO, or if doesn't affect anything if we have what we have today after the 29th. So there is no huge knife to our back holding us saying, if we don't put something in place by November 29th, we're screwed. But that is not the only the only benefit would be to us is if we can create a workable ordinance, they would come to us instead of go to the MSPC.
Right.
I'm not sure that our community is going to create a workable enough ordinance, or any community in our area is going to create a workable enough ordinance that they're not going to go to the MPS anyway. So by the fear of it's coming, let's not create let's not make us make a really quick decision on an ordinance.
Thank you for this. I think this is a really important perspective, and the fact that now puts you at a whole different standpoint where you have the time to spend a little bit thinking about priorities and strategies and those sort of things. And there are communities that have the knife in the back, but luckily we're not one of them. Yes.
So 233, these are for all projects, solar over 50 megawatts, wind over 100. But does it specify acreage?
It does not specify acreage. It's entirely based on the capacity, the megawatts. But typically, a 50 megawatt solar project is probably around 500 acres large.
And then wind is probably.
So it's always a little bit tricky, the space that the turbine takes.
Yeah.
I think you would generally say 0.5 acres per megawatt. But the entire project,
Yeah.
so I think don't quote me on this, but I think like 100 megawatt project is like a square mile of like overall project boundary.
Yeah, I think that what I've seen in presentations is they're doing the 50 megawatt is between 300 and 500 acres for solar, and the wind is 600 acre plots, because when you go to these presentations, they'll usually have your community on a map and then have little squares that show you how big those areas are, and you can place them around the map, and that's the areas that they're showing in the squares in those presentations that I've been to.
And for the third, the battery storage,
5
they're super
acres.
small. They're like 5 acres.
Yeah.
And then I'm confused about the CREO, where you're talking about screening. So that doesn't apply in a
Screening is a standard that is not listed in section 2268 of the law.
Right.
Hence, you can't put it in an ordinance and claim it to be a CREO.
Okay, so then does that mean if we have a CREO, a developer could put in a proposed project with no screening at all? And we couldn't say, could you please put one in, or what?
That would then make your ordinance workable.
Right.
It's not the sense of the law, but it's probably something the developer can easily work with. If everything else is very
We couldn't
CREO-ish.
require it and claim that it is a CREO.
Yeah.
Correct. And at that point, I wouldn't advise you to call it a CREO. If there's any chance that you deny it because they don't have screening, or then there are a bunch of penalties associated with that. And at that point, it may be smarter, after talking to your attorney, to not claim it to be a CREO. You have the risk that they go to the state, but the chance is probably very low.
A property owner who's leasing their land could ask for a screening?
Yes. Sandy attended with the Washtenaw County Conservation District. We had a workshop series earlier, I think in the spring, mainly for landowners, seeing this new legislation coming and basically telling landowners, you guys have the power to put some of those things in your leases that now local governments can no longer put in an ordinance necessarily, or not without consequences. There's some great guidance from Ohio State University. MSU Extension also has guidance for leases for solar and what landowners should consider and think about. And often what we see, or what is included in these leases too, is decommissioning. So if at any point the landowner decides, I don't want to renew my lease after 30 years, please take all of this stuff away, that there is the legal basis in the lease that the developer has to remove everything again. because decommissioning too is something that, workable or the way there's decommissioning and funding being made available for decommissioning in the state process and for CREOs as well. But it's less on the terms of many local governments. We've got a lot of pushback from MTA and some of those details and the decommissioning plans. But yes, leases can include anything.
At one point, you also said developers like to be close to transmission lines.
Mhm.
What does the word close mean to you?
So traditionally, before PA 233, developers would look for anything in like a land that is 3 miles away from transmission infrastructure would still be okay.
So as everybody knows, 3 miles from a transmission line. So our townships are only 6 miles, and we have a transmission line that runs right down the middle. So 3 miles means the entire township.
And that the 3 miles is not the furthest away extending
Right.
solar project, for example. It could be the beginning.
Right. So when
Yeah.
Madeline says 3 mile or close to a transmission line, it's not the same thing as we think of as close to a transmission line.
That's kind of how proud developers have in the past told us, like, that's kind of generally what they're looking for. They're looking at the state of Michigan map and not necessarily a county map.
I have a map in my presentation that shows 1 mile from the transmission lines, and it is maybe 85% of the township. So the only place that would not reach then is the lakes that we have. So, which it would be hard for them to put solar
wind
on
turbines.
wind turbines on the lakes.
Germany, they do floating solar now, which is really fun.
Yes.
But you have a question?
Yeah, I don't know if I can make this public comment time, what's your accommodation?
Yes.
I want to make one comment right away about how close it is to transmission. Because, and also about whether for my land, which is the subject of another project, which the planning commission knows about, which is under conceptual review for. I turned them both away because is I think the capacity to take that extra power at that location. How the capacity. That's kind of my first thing. It's actually more subtle than that. Only the developers really understand what they're looking at. But they do have criteria. It's good. And the thing is, if I had said yes, they would have been ready to go. They would have come to the county. It could happen. I think this was really great presentation. There was one other strategy that I'd like to hear you possibly comment on. It's not so much local control versus the MPSC, getting a balance right. Developer might not really care whether they're in Sylvan Township or Sharon. But we make our ordinance less hospitable. Or I wouldn't even recommend that. I don't think we want to be less hospitable. I think we want to preserve what we care about, right? But if it ends up that they think it's less hospitable, they might not go to the MPSC. They might just go out to Sharon Town, go there. And they might just leave us alone. And especially those big projects. We don't have a lot of large tracts of land anyway. I mean, a lot of this stuff doesn't really matter. It's just my public comment. It sounds to me like we should write an ordinance based on what we want. What we care about are values, such as like screening or whatever. For the big projects and the medium projects. Just wake up. But not try to base it on whether we like solar or not. Just base it on the interests of the surrounding community. Not try to make it draconian, force it out, but if they don't like it, they could probably find better land at a lower price somewhere else. The price of our land here is rather high. It's already in the distance center. Sure.
Again, another reason why Patrick probably didn't sell his land to the developer or to the solar person is because he could develop his land for, if he wanted to, for more money than they would offer him for it for a solar developer.
That was actually not a consideration in my case. I'm not maximizing profit anyway. Let's do it. I'm wondering what makes all the noise? Is it inverters or something?
It's inverters, yes.
I guess
And
having the large collection of them in close proximity just amplifies the noise.
right, and depending on what the wind is, and even among inverters, there are really quiet inverters and really noisy inverters. So some in Shiawassee County, you sometimes hear them from the road, depending on how the wind blows. In Calhoun County, they're a lot quieter. You know that because you've attended our bus tours.
So we could perhaps put a more restrictive sound provision in there. And it would just increase the cost of them having to buy quieter inverters.
Yeah.
That cost was kind of technical.
Right, at the end of the day, it all goes into their calculations and what, depending on what you require for everything that you put in ordinance, the screening, the sound, at some point it tips the economic viability scale of the developer.
And we can do, we can say whatever we want for this project under 50 megawatts, right?
Yes,
Okay, my other question is something that might not.
We can say whatever we want for the project's over.
Has there been any concerns about electromagnetic radiation from this?
that's a good question, and I don't really know what the lay of the research is on that. It's not a, and that's why I
Wind
don't
is
have a good
easier.
answer for you
I'll
right
do
now.
more wind.
But I'm happy if you send me an email to kind of look into that and see, kind of like what the science says to that.
I have
Yes.
another question for you. On your timeline slide, again, you had said it's 365 days for the MPSC. That's after they receive a complete application.
Yes,
And their application it could take, I mean, we all have seen this before. This is the Subdivision Map Act recreated into a solar act. So after the Subdivision Map Act went into effect, we know that nobody has gone through a subdivision in the last 25 years. So, and it's just because the state has made it so onerous to go through the process. So it's 365 days once they get an application. The same in a CREO. It's 120 days or 240 days from the day they submit their application to you. So, I mean, it would almost be impossible to, if you had a CREO that actually asked for the information that the MPSC is asking for, to review that information in 120 days.
and the CREO doesn't include all of what the MPSC asks.
Right.
The MPSC try to really beef it up.
So
So,
if our ordinance, if we created an ordinance, it would be from when we received a complete application.
receive an application.
Yeah, but
That's
if we
another thing
wanted,
that is
if we
not
wanted to
clear
do
in
it
the
in,
law.
incompatible ordinance.
Right, I just wanted to get at the point that the CREO, the law is not clear enough. The 120 days start counting when an application is received. not
Correct.
When a complete application is received.
I'm not imagining that we're ever going to create a Creo here. I'm not even going to use any of my brain cells to act like we're going to ever create a Creo. So we, again, when we create our ordinance, it will be from the day we get a complete application.
And I think it's an unconventional way of thinking about buying wiggle room, right? Like, I don't think that we ever think about, oh, how fast can we do it?
Yeah.
You also you want to consider how often do you even meet? How often does your board meet? What are notification requirements? You want to give yourself a little bit of flexibility, so.
Yeah, so if we required, like, I have looked at the surrounding communities, even though we have one surrounding community that is working on a current ordinance that they're claiming is workable, but it's still requiring a special use permit and site plan review, which is, we know that takes 3 months to go through the process. So that's at a minimum, and that's if they get you all, I mean, they're asking for a lot of information that would have to be reviewed by engineering consultants, because we don't have these people on staff that can review Flickr studies and these types of things. So it just, I'm skeptical on workability. I would love to try to make some wiggle room to make them workable and maybe get us some $5,000 if, again, we ever had anybody that came into our community and wanted to pay the 60 grand per acre that our land currently costs to build a solar farm on or something like that. Yeah, they're looking to lease it. Right.
30-some years.
Yeah.
For solar, they are increasingly starting to buy, but maybe not necessarily here, but yeah, typically it's a lease, that's right. And I also want to kind of get at what, oh no, I forgot what I wanted to say. I appreciate that you're bringing up the substations rather than just transmission lines, because yes, traditionally they've looked at substation and it's easiest. There also needs to be space on the transmission infrastructure, if there's even like space on the highway to add more power. But especially for battery storage, I'm also starting to see developers being so interested in a project that they're willing to pay a lot of money to build a substation and to cut into transmission infrastructure and make it happen, even if there is no substation around. So generally, for sure, substations are preferred, but it is also possible without. Yes.
So onto the battery storage side, we would still receive the 5,000 per megawatt for battery storage also?
If it's permitted at the local level, yeah.
If it's permitted at
Yeah.
Again, the reason I ask is because battery storage areas have less impact, and it's more likely that we might create a workable ordinance around battery. As Madeline had said, that this area sees a battery storage facility in it, bringing up the problem with your lines being capable. What I have taken some classes on battery storage, and what these utilities are using them for is to move energy at off times of the day so that they can free up space on their lines. And then they're also fortifying the grid for if the grid goes down, they can turn that battery storage back onto those lines and get it out to the people that need it. And our community has some of the people that would probably be the most loud if they lose their energy compared to other locations. So I can see why they would put one in our location.
With battery storage, they really, I think, are interested. They're kind of all over the state, but especially in Southeast Michigan, because the off takers of the energy are nearby. Big urban centers are close. So,
So,
are there other questions or thoughts? I appreciate your comment on the timeline, because I think it is important to communicate what I hear from developers, which is time is money, but I'm very interested to hear from your guys. How realistic is that even that we can commit to anything time-wise. And it sounds like it may not be.
It's very,
feasible.
very hard for a small municipality because we don't have the staff.
Right.
So everything that they submit to us will be sent to a consultant for review because we can't review it in-house on our own. And then we have to get that review back. They have to then address the review questions. So before there's an actual complete application, and we see it here, you guys get some plans and you're like, well, wow, what about this? What about this? And then they want to continue the meeting to another date. And yet that's a month away because we only have one meeting every month. So that gets long. And then you have your special use permits that, you know, and your site plan review. At least here, the planning commission is the determining body on those. So it doesn't have the double. A lot of the smaller municipalities will have a special use permit has to then go to the township board for final approval with just a recommendation from the planning commission.
On this notion of workability, it seems very subjective to the developer. Are they talking about any sort of criteria of what would be reasonable from a workability standpoint, as opposed to unreasonable, or is it just purely going to be developer driven?
Purely developer driven. That's how the law was written to make it happen, to build projects at the end of the day. Yes, sir.
I just wanted to comment to the planning commission. One reason we might want to consider 50 megawatts solar in our plans is I'm hearing a lot from farmers who are finding it hard to keep their farms because it's just too expensive. And they want to be able to pass their farms on to their children. And their option is either to sell to developers, which could change our township, or they could lease a 30-year lease to a solar project of that size. That land would be turned into a pollinator habitat as well. So there would be grasses and deep-rooted plants underneath the solar panels. So that would regenerate the farmland during those 30 years without using chemicals and fertilizers and such. So then at the end of 30 years, they've collected money from that lease, keep it in the family, and then they'll have a regenerated farmland that they can farm again. So that's a very welcome option for our farmers who have that much land and want to keep it in the family and not sell it to developers and have a bunch of subdivisions around Sylvan Township.
Or to farm it again.
Who knows?
Oh, if it's going like it is right now in 30 years, if you got out of farming, it costs a small fortune to start back up again.
Yeah.
Scope of farming is different though today. World. It's changing. I think the more hands that get involved in the farming, small farms, bigger, I think we'll see a lot more vegetable farms, closer to urban areas. We are seeing that now. So things could change in 30 years.
Yeah, you never know.
And right now, this renewable energy we're talking about, the majority of corn in the state goes into renewable energy and ethanol.
40%.
So 40%. Yeah. 5-6 years ago, it was about 10%. So yeah, there's a big demand for renewable energy and solar and wind. It's all part of the whole picture.
Package.
So
You're gonna have to build in 30 years, you're gonna disassemble that one. What's out of that 400 acres, 300 acres you had there, that means you gotta put up another farm of some sort someplace else in order to get that energy back.
sure, there'll be other sources of energy, but other plants.
You have to go nuclear.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, anybody else have any questions?
I have a comment. So I think it was last year, I went on 2 tours. Now I'm there. Look at one in Isabella County area, which if you go north on 127, you'll know when you get to Isabella County because of all the wind generators. And the other tour was in the Battle Creek area. And at that time I asked, how far away can a solar farm be from a transmission line? At that time, you said 1 mile. Tonight, you're telling me 3 miles. I'm telling you, this industry is changing so fast. I mean, I felt comfort, okay, a mile. But now 3 miles, and what you said about how the size of the township is like, oh, we're gonna have to rethink everything.
That guy from DTE said they want it closer because it costs, what, $1 million to talk to these overhead power people? And stuff like that. He was here when they were with Chrysler. Want to redo that guy from DTE.
I don't know if I was here.
Well, they were talking.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, they were talking about $1 million and they want it closer. Because all these overhead power lines are,
What were they building?
they're putting in EV charger.
Oh, EV chargers.
Yep, and we got into this solar and stuff like that and power, and they said you want to be closer to it. So he was throwing around $1 million just to talk to these people with overhead because nobody owns them. The people out of Texas bought them all up. Overhead power and stuff like that. Just like that one, they were gonna buy this one on Francisco Road.
By the overhead power
No,
lines?
they were buying that because it was an outside company that put that farm up.
I'm
This was
confused. Oh, solar farm he's talking
That
about.
solar
Yes.
farm on Francisco Road.
Yeah, I mean, do I think that the utilities are going to buy the solar farms in the future? Yes, I definitely do believe that. That's why I am worried about taxation on these things too, because we all know that once the utilities buy them, they're going to try to get out of paying taxes on them, just like they do everything else. And then they're going to show me every year that they made $1.6 trillion this year in profit. And I'm going to go, how is this a quasi-governmental utility? But yes, so yes, do I think that they will buy them once these small developers build them? They might start building them themselves too.
They
Yes,
do.
yes, I know
Yes,
they
do
do.
buy them. They like to buy.
Yes. They don't need the third party in the middle of their energy. That's why they won't put them on, let us put them on our roofs as much.
Anybody have any final comments or concerns to put on the record before we adjourn? All right, motion to adjourn, please.
Wait, what about my presentation?
His presentation.
Sorry,
Yeah. Oh, you're in a hurry to get out of here tonight.
I don't have.
Oh. I'm just going to give you a quick presentation about the surrounding communities and a little bit about So I'm just going to go through these. These slides are there's a lot of them, but it's very quick because the point is that our neighboring communities don't currently have any compatible ordinances, that there is only one of the communities that is working on them. So the community that we have in the area, we have Linden Township. Linden Township so there is a few different things with solar. Or with wind, solar, and electric. You have private, which is accessory to a house. You have roof mounted solar, ground mounted solar. You have windmills like at farms. You have these little tiny wind generating systems that you can put on your roofs of your structures. Those are private. The way Linden Township is dealing with them is if it's attached to a building, you have to meet the building requirements of the zoning ordinance. If it's attached, if it's an accessory structure itself, like the solar arrays are, they have to meet the accessory structure requirements. Same with their wind, they actually, on private, they have regulations for private wind. They restrict them, to the height of the primary structure, which there it's 35 feet. So you can have a windmill that's 35 feet tall. There's some other requirements in their code. Their setback goes up to 1.5 times the height of the structure. If it's a standalone on the wind, and they also have reflective colors, but it's pretty easy to put a small wind station on private land. Again, private would mean that electricity is being used to support the primary use of the property. So, and then they have commercial regulations. Their commercial regulations are all require special use permits. So none of them are currently a CREO. They are looking at their regulations currently also to see if they can manipulate them to alter them. They're not going to create a CREO there either. But their current regulations that they have their solar, they have a 75-foot setback with a 15-foot height. They have fencing, lighting regulations. They again they only allow them in the rural residential, which is their ag zoning district, and the industrial zoning district with a special use permit. So, I mean, it's not a terrible ordinance. It's not terribly onerous to go through. Maybe a developer will come and go through it. 60% of their land is owned by the state for parkland. So they are very restricted in what would actually go on in that township. And their wind ordinance that they have in place, they restrict the height. I mean, they only allow them in their industrial district. So it's super restrictive. If you know their industrial district, it's one piece of property and it's the old dump. So, and it's 175-foot maximum height on that structure also, which I believe is low. I don't know. What is the current wind turbines from the 500, and that's from the base to the top of the tip when it's pointed up, right? So this code was written a few years ago and they were smaller at that time. But again, 500 feet is going to be a lot harder for a planning commission to get their head around it, saying let's approve something that's 500 feet tall. So they don't have anything currently on battery storage in Linden Township. Dexter Township is the one township that is working towards a workable ordinance. And I do have copies of their latest draft of their ordinance that I hand out to you guys. And you can take a look at it. It's following, I'm sure you've seen a lot of these. It's following the same format that I've seen other communities that are doing these right now. And I think we'll probably, when we do create an ordinance, even though our ordinance might not, like Patrick said, will address our concerns, we'll probably follow this type of format. And it will just be because it will be easier for everybody in the future to review. And citizen or developers that are looking at one code and another will be able to track it. Your zoning administrators in the future will be able to read it better because they'll have seen the exact same format in most communities. So, and this one's being written by Megan Minnick at Carlisle and Wortman. So I'm sure she's doing a bunch of them right now. But in our area, nobody's really working on them. So I called next Sharon Township. Sharon Township was actually working on a ordinance, and then they basically put it on hold and said, no, we don't even want to talk about it. We're not going to consider this. We don't want to consider this. Let's just wait and see what happens. Let's leave our ordinance in place. They do have an ordinance in place currently that is pretty, so they do allow large scale wind with wind and solar with special use permits in the agricultural and recreational districts there. They have more restrictions than would be considered workable or would be considered a CREO. So more than likely it's a what do you guys call them? Unworkable ordinance would be what would be considered an unworkable ordinance. But again, their ordinances are for all large scale wind and solar, and that's basically anything over 1 megawatt to 1 million megawatts. So they don't have anything in their ordinance currently on small scale, and I couldn't get a hold of their zoning administrator to try to figure out how they're approving private, but I'm guessing they're approving it like most other people are, which is just using the regulations that are currently in place, because I can't imagine that they would not approve small scale. Although we'll talk about Norville Township here in a second. I didn't write about it, but I do work for them, so I can tell you they don't like small scale solar and they don't approve it. So Lima Township, they currently don't have anything at all in their zoning ordinance on wind or solar or battery storage. I did talk to the zoning administrator there. They are approving the private just based on if it meets any of the requirements of the zoning code. They're just going to approve it. But they have no regulations, and they haven't even started to consider regulations on large. So they're to what Madeline had said is the do nothing phase. Don't pass an updated ordinance and just say, go to the MPSC. We don't want to talk to you. Again, though, I don't know if their land, I mean, they're really close to Ann Arbor. I can imagine their land costs more than our land here. So let's see, Sylvan Township. Currently, what we do here is with private wind and solar, we would approve them based on your zoning regulations. So if it's attached to the house, we consider it part of the primary structure, has to meet the requirements of the primary structure. We would do the same thing with private battery storage, because we've all seen private battery storage, and maybe some of you have it, the Tesla battery in your house or whatever. It's just attached to the side of your garage, and we don't get involved. So wind, we would do the same thing. Ground mounted, it is based on the accessory building requirements. And wind, ground mounted standalone could only be 25 feet, because that was what our accessory structure requirements would be. Commercial wind and solar, we don't have anything currently in place. So if they came into us and asked us currently, hey, I want to put up this solar farm here, what we would tell them as the planner would be, all right, let's look at our uses and where they're allowed, and we would look at the most similar use to a battery, like a fuel yard or something, a mini storage facility or something. It would be allowed in our industrial districts. So we would tell them that, and they would be like, well, this is crazy. So eventually we're going to have to address the actual use, because it's a use that's more prevalent now. And if you district, and then they can, that we don't have a lot of industrial, so they wouldn't obviously put them there. And the next slide that I have is your typical types of regulations. So the types of regulations that you see in these ordinances are locational. Madeline talked about it. This would be like, if you wanted, in a Creo, you must allow them everywhere. But in a workable ordinance, you could have regulations like they're allowed in the agricultural zoned district, or they're allowed based on a zoning district, or they're allowed within 1 mile of the transmission lines. That would be a different type of locational regulation. The other things that you see are setbacks. Obviously, a Creo requires the setbacks would be a 300-foot from neighboring structure, 50-foot from a public street, and 50-foot from a property line. Anything over that would no longer be a Creo. And if we go back to the Dexter Township regulations, so what they're putting into effect right now is 100-foot setback for solar from a public road and a neighboring structure. And they also have landscaping requirements in place. They have taken some of your advice on that, which makes that a little bit more flexible in the regulation. So it's, when it comes to the planning commission, they can look at the area and say, this area needs some landscaping, this area, along the street, you need the landscape. If you have a adjacent home somewhere, you need the landscape, but they look at it on a case-by-case basis. So, setbacks, you can increase them, decrease them. In wind, it's 2 times the height to the neighboring structure, and 1 times the height to the right-of-way or the property line. So again, when we look at our ordinance, or we'll look at surrounding ordinances. On Dexter's ordinance, they actually used those requirements. So they did not go above and beyond those requirements in their proposed ordinance that they have. And then we have the setbacks for the battery storage, which is the same as for the solar. It's the 300 and the 50 and the 50. And I believe in Dexter's proposed ordinance, they're using those numbers also. So they're staying with those numbers. On that next slide that I have for you with the 2 maps on it, that shows the maps of our transmission lines. And then the highlighted area is the area of the township that's within 1 mile of that transmission line. Just to give you an idea of where, because I have heard people say they want to do an overlay district and base it on a dimension from the transmission lines. And I'm like, well, yeah, that's great. I mean, excellent. Here's 1 mile from the transmission lines. I mean, those 3 transmission lines run pretty clearly over most of our property, other than the land that we currently have that's owned by the state and our lakes. So up in the corner there. Other requirements, height, you're always going to see a height requirement. And I showed you here the Creo requirements, what Creo would allow. Like you saw in some of the other townships ordinances, they're using lower height regulations. Like Linden Township has a 15-foot height standard, and I think Sharon Township does also. I mean, 25 feet's not that tall. I'm not sure. 15 feet seems even shorter. And then the wind, the way a Creo works is it's the height allowed under a determination of no hazard for air navigation by the Federal Aviation Administration. So I'm not sure. Do you know what that height is? It's, if you're closer to an airport, it's like if I'm out here in the middle of nowhere, not near an airport, is it up where the planes fly?
But it's basically equal to no height limit unless the FAA.
All right. So it's pretty high. So I don't know, but we've heard that the size of these is around 500 feet now.
Very, very modern ones.
Yeah. And batteries, solar, so it's 25 feet. I wish I would have taken a picture of a battery storage facility for you. What they look like is a whole bunch. Madeline might have one. Yeah, Madeline might have one. They look like a whole bunch of like the back ends of semi trucks after you take off the container and just lined up in a row. So yeah, so I mean, I'm guessing on those we could screen those types of structures and still get them in. There does seem to be more immediate benefit to having a battery storage to the community than there are a lot of the solar. The benefit is great because we're creating green energy, but it's going to, it's not dispersed to just the community. It's going to everybody in the state. All right, let's hear this.
I'm so sorry, but I think I have to push back a little bit on this. So the big projects that we're talking about with FP33, they don't give you any more grid reliability. The only time when a battery project has immediate exclusive benefits for is when they're so small that they fit on the distribution grid rather than the
All right.
infrastructure. But that's not the projects that are 50 megawatts.
Oh, that isn't the bigger ones.
The newest, most modern distribution maximum take a 20 megawatts.
So can you explain what they're using the big ones to do?
It's kind of the same thing. So they have multiple functions. The big function is to basically charge the energy when there's little off-takers, like when energy is being produced, but we don't use it in that instant, it's being charged to big lithium-ion batteries initially. And then in the afternoon or whenever everyone wants to turn on their TV at the same time, then is when the batteries would charge back onto the grid. So sometimes these batteries are next to wind or even next to natural gas plants in other parts of the country, just to keep the gas plant going and charge even when people don't use that energy at the moment. So there are these projects where battery is with maybe solar, natural gas, whatever, but more so what we're seeing in Michigan is that they're being considered standalone projects. And they basically sit in the middle of nowhere and just charge energy when it's cheap and sell it back to the grid when we need the power. They also have some voltage stabilization benefits. Consumers has a very small BESS somewhere in Standish to trying to make the distribution there work a little bit longer and more effectively. What they need to modernize that infrastructure there. The BESS basically helps them.
So what is the renewable? I mean, why did this get into our PA 233? Because it just seems like it's a way that the energy companies can make more money.
They can make more money, but it also just makes integration of more renewables easier.
Oh, because our renewables charge it different.
Because
Yeah.
renewables are
Unpredictable.
when the wind blows.
All right, that makes
Some
sense.
of you may know the Ludington Pump Storage Facility.
Yeah.
It actually was built in the 70s to keep their power plants going in the night.
Yep.
And so the batteries are more flexible and quicker, chargeable and dischargeable. So overall, in like big Michigan grid scheme of things,
Yeah.
they help.
So that makes sense because you can run a coal electricity all the time, but we're going to have solar and wind that is only charging maximum at certain times. So we're going to have to store a lot more energy.
Right.
So that's how it got into the PA 233. So excellent.
And in November, Michigan was the first Midwestern state to actually have an energy storage target, like the legal goal of 2,500 megawatts by 2029. We have one right now.
All right, noise. The next thing that is on our or another regulation, noise. Currently, the CREO is 55 decibels. Our township ordinance currently, our noise ordinance, it has a 61 decibel one-time max at between 7 and 10 p.m. and then 55 decibels residential between 10 and 7. So, and then commercial 71 and 61. So, again, like Madeline had said, the measuring is different. And our noise ordinance just says it can't exceed 61 decibels. It doesn't tell you, a time frame that it happens, which is, I mean, somebody shoots off a gun or a firework, it's going to be more than this for that one time thing. I don't know how I would get out there to measure it, but that's how our noise ordinance scales up, just to let you guys know. Process, in your ordinance, you're going to create the process that they're going to have to go through. Most townships, all of the townships that surround us are using special use permits currently. I'm not sure that we're going to see many CREOs in this area that don't use they won't be CREOs, but will have special use permits requirements in there. The fear with the special use permit to a developer is it's a discretionary project. And at that point, then they'll come in, they'll apply for the special use permit. You guys all have seen this. The room will be filled with people and you'll deny it because it's not compatible with the adjacent uses of the property. That automatically, then they're going to go to the MPSC and go, well, these guys aren't going to be usable to work with. Can you just approve this? So it is, I mean, they're doing it. Actually, the MTA's CREO has a special use permit. That's why I wrote you that thing the other day. And I was like, and the MTA's CREO is written by our municipal attorney. Yeah. So, and I'm like, how is this a CREO? This cannot be a CREO. There is no way that a special use permit can be required and you'd be considering a CREO, because we all know what happens with a special use permit, especially if you had a 700-acre solar farm come in. You don't think this room, I mean, we would have to go down and get a theater somewhere for all the people that would come into this room to complain about it. And then you're going to be looking at discretionary standards, and you guys are going to be up here going, oh, yeah. So, and then you have application, the other regulation that you see in all of these ordinances, application requirements. So, and you have things like fire and emergency response plans, noise reports, photometric lighting plans, flicker reports, that the storage has to meet all the national requirements for, there's a whole list of these national, federal regulations. I don't even know what they are, but they're always written into the ordinance for storage. And then decommissioning plans and bonds. So, and then additional things that you see in regulations are glare requirements for solar. So, and then glare studies and all of these things that have to happen to be able to figure out how to make the glare go away so it doesn't impact somebody else. Wind, the shadow flicker, radar, color of the towers and the color of the blades, control, brake controls and controls. So if something happens, on these wind ones, you also see ice shear requirements, because I guess there's some sort of study out there that shows that they can shoot an icicle a long distance. Have you heard, I mean, have you ever seen this happen?
I don't see this happen, but it is a common thing that does happen. It's called ice throw. Ice sticks on the surface of the blade and then just like it's pushed up, and that's what this effect are looking for. And also, they're tweaking the design of the wind turbines to just that to kind of mitigate.
And then one of the additional regulations that you see with battery storage a lot are training requirements for your local fire department. And we've heard that one because we just heard it on a tow yard that they want to have training for the electric vehicles. So, So those things are all happening. So what I want to hear from you guys is, what do you think we should do to move forward, move the township forward on this item? So the information that we can talk about is, CREO, not CREO, regulations that you want to see in place, those types of things. We also have regulations that were created under a previous planning consultant that I will, once I hear from you guys, all of you guys, what you want to see in this community, I'll review that ordinance that she created. Also, I'll review all of the ordinances in the neighboring communities. We'll put together something that takes all of that information and creates the ordinance that Linden Township wants. And then I'll bring it to you again and say, hey, does this look like what you said you wanted? And then you'll review it all again. You'll give me comments. And then once we tweak that one more time, we'll come to a public. I believe we have to do something, because we can't just not address a viable use in our zoning ordinance, because it gets to where they're coming to us and then they're going to say, you don't even allow this here. That's illegal. You have to allow. What do we want to do?
I think from my perspective, the closer we can get to a workable ordinance, it's probably the sweet spot for us. Because if we can work in good faith with developers, they're probably more likely risk of having to go through the rigmarole of the MPSC process. I also think the workable approach is favorable at this point in time due to the lack of the case law. If we overcorrect and then it's challenged and case law swings that pendulum, then we're going to be having this conversation again, as opposed to just saying, hey, here's what we want as a community. Let's try to move this towards a workable ordinance. And then if case law changes things, we have a smaller span in which we need to correct. That's just my thought process. I can jump in again. I think the previous draft ordinance is at least a good place to start from a conversational perspective, as well as reviewing all those meeting minutes again, because there was quite a bit of public comment about their desires and what folks want to see. And I think one of the things that was clear from those meetings, and to one of your points in your slide, I think it was pretty clear from the public perspective that private use is desirable. And so I think going back, looking at the minutes, going back to that draft, it's not a bad place to start.
Right.
Doesn't say we have to land there, but I think starting there is good.
Yes.
I agree. It's nice to not have, it's nice to use the information that we spent
Yeah.
months on also.
And I would imagine that, yeah, again, with the private, you guys are mostly okay with what we're doing currently, which is allowing private based on our zoning regulations. So that will, more than likely, that's what is in the draft ordinance, but that's what would be in the end result ordinance anyway, is we're going to allow private. We might even allow larger height limits on certain private regulations than what is currently in our code, which would just allow a 35-foot high thing.
So the basis for that ordinance that was being written, she was using the Graham Institute's book, very similar to this. So, thank you. Where would we be without you?
We also, so we still have copies of it. It obviously is out of date with the new law, but on our page, we basically annotated the PDF PDF,
Yeah.
to see if this is in alignment with page 33 or this contradicts it. I have a ton more copies also, if you're interested.
Yeah.
Well, I would like a copy.
I just brought one, but I can send you how many ever you'd like. For
Solar.
So that's what our,
Were we talking about wind and anything else though also, right?
we were-
Yes.
Yeah, so this is solar, MSU extension has one.
MSU extension has the one for the wind. And then you have the new battery one.
Did I give you one?
I don't have it yet, but
Oh, I-
it's on your website.
On our website. Actually, yeah, and I will need to make another round of adjustments based on MPC stuff.
Yeah.
I dropped it, I released this 2 days before MPC did theirs, so.
Yep. So yes, I hear you with all of that. And I have started to review her ordinance and I actually like a lot of what she has written in there. Some of the items might be more onerous than they need to be because again, with the private stuff, you just want to say if it's, I mean, it's fine, go. You don't want to have to go through like 40 different things to figure out if you can build a roof mounted solar panel. You know, I'm like, it's part of the house, it's part of the house, it's fine. Same with battery storage in the future. Obviously, in the future, our battery storage is going to be a little bit different for houses than we currently have. We're going to want more battery storage. So we can see right now, we have the battery storage that we have that we're buying, you're putting on the wall of your garage, but I can definitely see small buildings of battery storage being built. But they'll just be used like sheds and everything else. I mean, we have wood burning things out in the middle of the yard and we just call them accessory buildings. So so that's how we'll move forward. But I think we've heard from Cliff that we're going to try to get as close to workable as possible. And I think that's what I'm hearing from most people. But we're obviously going to want things like screening requirements and things like that will preserve what we enjoy here in Sylvan Township, which is I'm guessing according to your master plan, it's the rural character of the community that you're trying to preserve.
That's very. consistent
Workable,
with
but
what
not
our
workable.
says, Yeah.
Right.
I think the direction from the township board is to recommendation, we probably need to vote on that. Vote to send a recommendation up to the board. Is that what they're asking for?
No, so they have already made their recommendation that we move forward with an ordinance.
Right.
So we're just here today to gather information from you before I go back and put together a first draft. I wanted to make sure that, you know, you got all the information from Madeline on these new regulations, and there was a lot, and I think we all understand what's happening now. And then we know where we were with Rebecca Harvey, and then I know now what you guys want between what has happened since Rebecca left, which is PA 233, and now. So you want to take what Rebecca had already created, review it against the PA 233, see where it would be super off for a developer, and then come back with suggestions. So, and then with her ordinance, she has a lot of other regulations in there for like biofuels and things like that. I'm just going to leave those in there because I'm guessing, I mean, you guys wanted those in there. So
Yeah, I think it initially started as solar, kind of evolved into what it became as it rolled along.
yeah, so there's a lot of different alternative energies that are talked about in there. And I'll look at them, but I'm going to put them forward to you guys to make sure you want those in there. I mean, I'm not exactly sure what other townships are doing on those other items yet, but I will look through them all and figure it out. I definitely know that none of the surrounding communities have anything on a lot of those alternative energies that were talked about in there. So I would guess that a lot of those alternative energy regulations are coming from the larger communities that have those things in them. So
Too complicated with some of these alternatives
yeah.
right now.
All right. I think we got a good starting point. So next steps is obviously now it's back into my court. I'm going to work on it. Hopefully, we'll have something to review either, if not next month, the month after, which will be December, which everybody loves meeting in December, right? Y'all don't have anything to do. No Christmas presents or anything to buy, but that's all right. We'll see. Hopefully, I'm guessing it will be December and not November, but we'll see. Other than that, that's my presentation.
Thank you, Scott.
Yep.
Leah had said she had a couple of comments to make before we close out. Or are you good?
Yeah, the solar and everything. I was told that it didn't come from an everyday worker, that Chrysler is having some issues. I don't know. This come really, really direct. So it's kind of scary. So maybe we'll have a solar farm there eventually.
We definitely have screening. It's very well screened.
Yeah, it's very well screened. You wouldn't ever be able to see them. I mean, yes, if Chrysler is having a problem, that still is a state of the art plant or facility that they have there, and we are in a area where the education and the workforce is, so I wouldn't worry so much about those types of things. If that happens, do I think Toyota or another company would buy that facility? And yes. So, and if not, it's zoned for what it's zoned for. If you're jobs, we can look at what we would need to rezone that to keep the tax base in the jobs. But
Being I live at the lake, there's been a lot of controversy over that burned house. It's been burned for about a year.
yes, I've told everybody that has asked, fill out a code enforcement request form. They are online. I just had one in your community for another dilapidated house on Kavanaugh Lake Road, and they have received their first letter for the abandoned house ordinance. It's at, but somebody needs to fill out a code enforcement request form and submit it to my email address or anything. Just submit it, and then I will send them a letter. On somebody, not on the township, but on somebody it is.
Halloween coming up? Who knows what could happen out there?
Who knows?
Are we doing anything about dark skies?
It is on hold until we have future date to figure out if we have the funds, the money to move those forward. But yeah, I mean, eventually we'll have a dark skies ordinance. It is on our list of items that we'll be considering once a new board is in place. So
I had someone complain about a new house out at the lake. So I drove by it the other night and yeah, their lights are on the structure all night and they do shine into the next house. I mean, if you were trying to sleep in there.
yeah, let's see if you have any current regulations for residential. Oh, of course, I'm getting the spinning wheel of death, but you may have regulations in place currently on the type of lighting that you can put on your residential structures, so let me see. Outdoor advertising, pedestrian performance guarantees. And I can actually look into this and get back to you, Leah, because some communities do already, I mean, it's not, dark skies again is just a word for anything that to do with lighting, but a lot of communities have requirements that lighting be shielded, lighting be directed to the ground, lighting not cast across property lines. There are regulations in place that you may have some, so I'll take a look and see if there's anything in the residential districts. I know you have lighting standards for street lights and other things in your code currently. But I'm not sure about residential. I haven't got a complaint yet on a light. Usually you get them. I know Linden Township has regulations on shielding their lights because I've got a complaint there before, and then I had to go out and tell the guy that he needs to shield his floodlight on his back barn, and he just put a shield on it and it's directed to the ground now.
Kearns Record Service, what's happening with that?
So I contacted him actually this week, and they are claiming now that they're looking to submit either this month or next month. So we'll see. I mean, I have contacted them every month since they got their last approval, and I usually get that answer that they're working on it and they're going to submit. They're working on it. They're going to submit. I have given them their estimates for the escrow for the cost to review from the engineer and the environmental consultant. So they know what they need to submit when they submit, which would be their $900 fee plus their $8,000 escrow.
I know somebody recently that needed a record, and it's kind of an issue out here. We don't have any record service. That's all I have.
Anybody else? Motion to adjourn, Sandy. Oh, I thought I heard you say something.
No.
And then do I have a second?
All right, Tom seconded for the first.
Sure, I'll second it.
Thank you all.